Hello, I'm Becca. Hopefully you know that by now. So I'm going to talk to you today, surprisingly enough, about what we do at CAP. And I'm going to kind of talk to you about the biblical context for that. To start us off though, I'd really love you to think about what is the biggest crowd of people that you've ever been a part of. Might have been a sporting event or a music festival or some kind of rally. A huge crowd of people can really be quite an incredible sight, really vast sea of faces. Hopefully you can all kind of visualize what that looks like a little bit. Think about maybe the pyramid stage at Glastonbury Festival, yeah? Or maybe a packed Wembley Stadium for a football cup final. It's sometimes really hard for us to grasp the numbers involved in an enormous gathering like that, isn't it? But these crowds are nothing compared to if we tried to picture a crowd filled with the millions of people in the UK who are currently trapped in poverty. You probably know the cost of living is at pretty eye-watering levels and incomes just aren't keeping up. So poverty is creeping into more and more households. According to research from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, 13.4 million people are living in poverty in the UK today. 13.4 million. To put that into context for you, that's enough to fill more than 150 Wembley stadiums. Yeah, that's a lot. It's impossible to imagine such a vast crowd of people, isn't it? Just physically can't imagine what that would look like. And for anyone who has never experienced it, it's really easy to hear the word poverty and to not really be quite sure what exactly that means. So CAP's Director of External Affairs, a guy called Gareth McNabb, explains it very simply, but equally starkly. And he says this: poverty is when you haven't got enough income to be able to afford what you need for life. All we have to do is listen to the news to become very quickly aware of the brutal impact of poverty. It's not a secret that people are having to routinely choose between having a meal or heating the water to have a wash. They can't afford both. So CAP recently commissioned a YouGov poll to find out more about the reality of living in poverty in the UK. According to that poll, 16 million people have been forced to skip meals recently due to cost. That's a quarter of the population, just in case you didn't know. A quarter of the population skipping meals due to cost. It also found that half of all adults, that's 25 million people, went without heating at some point last winter because they couldn't afford the energy costs. Half of all people. That's crazy, isn't it? Probably, at least some of you can relate. We're all trying to save money where we can at the moment. But many are finding themselves in these impossible situations every day. The YouGov poll found that 6 million people, that's 1 in every 11, have gone without heat on a daily basis as a result of poverty. The never-ending pressure of financial insecurity has a really detrimental effect on people's mental health and well-being, as you can probably imagine. And it means that even a small, unexpected cost can push them over the edge into problem debt. They're literally living on a knife edge. And even whilst I was sat writing this talk, I received a message in a WhatsApp group of friends of mine, not from a client, that was polling for opinions amongst this friendship group about whether to top up the electricity or buy food with the last tenner in her bank account before payday. But for many of our clients, I'm really aware that this dilemma comes much more regularly than just that once a month, right before payday. I dropped round to see a really lovely client earlier in the year, whilst it was still, cold. And she, bless her, apologised to me that she hadn't put the heating on because she hadn't known I was coming. Like, she wouldn't put the heating on for herself because she couldn't afford it. But for me, she would have done it. And the scale of the problem is so huge, so large, that it can be really hard to put into perspective. But we know that God calls us, don't we, the church, to serve those in need. With such a vast crowd in front of us, it can be really hard to know how to respond. But at CAP, we believe that Scripture provides us with clear guidance on how to respond to poverty. So to help us to consider our response to poverty today, I'd like to take you back a couple of thousand years to a small rural location by the Sea of Galilee, the site of a well-known miracle of Jesus. Hopefully some of you will have heard of it, the feeding of the 5,000. Okay. Not getting very much back from you. You have heard of it, right? In this story, Jesus is confronted by a vast crowd of people. The passage tells us that there were 5,000 men besides women and children. And most scholars agree that the size of the crowd could have been, once we take into account those women and children, well in excess of 20,000 people. So, huge numbers. As we read the Gospels, we can see that this crowd would have been full of people who were broken, hurting, and outcast. These were people who were searching for healing, for hope, and for meaning, not dissimilar to a large part of the UK population today. And at this point, it's also worth noting that Jesus, in the middle of his earthly ministry, has also just learned of the death of his relative John the Baptist. So he's taking some time out by himself to grieve. In Matthew 14, 13 to 14, it says, "When Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. Hearing of this, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed their sick." People were so desperate to encounter Jesus, to receive his healing, to hear his teaching, and to experience the hope that he gave, that they travelled in their masses to meet him, even to this remote, solitary place. Jesus' response to the arrival of the vast multitude was actually quite remarkable. He didn't sense the coming crowd and turn a blind eye or sneak over the top of the hill for some private time, and he absolutely could have been forgiven for doing that. After all, he was grieving the loss of a family member. And that's a really hard thing to do, as a lot of you will know. When confronted with the crowd of people experiencing debt and poverty today, it can be tempting for us to turn a blind eye or to think of it as someone else's problem. Jesus doesn't do either of these things. Jesus faces the crowd, takes note of the crowd, and allows the interruption into his life. Jesus did more than just notice that crowd. He could have acknowledged their struggle and sympathized while continuing on his way. But the Bible says he had compassion on them. Just going to briefly have a little drink. He had compassion on them. This word compassion is used multiple times throughout the Gospels, probably you're aware, to describe Jesus' actions towards those who were marginalized and suffering. For example, in Luke 7, Jesus sees a widow mourning the loss of her son and is moved with compassion. He acts by raising the woman's son back to life. Now, one way to interpret this word compassion is to say that Jesus' heart went out to them. However, a more accurate translation is way more raw than this, and it means to be moved in the inward parts. In the society of Jesus' time on earth, compassion was said to be felt deep in a person's internal organs, in the intestines. Don't know why, but that's what they thought. So when Jesus saw that crowd of desperately suffering people, he was moved, not with a soft, gentle feeling of sadness, but with deep, gut-wrenching compassion. In the ancient world, this attitude of deep and raw compassion was rare, and it wasn't seen as an admirable virtue. St. Augustine quoted the ancient Stoic philosopher Seneca in saying that compassion is the vice of a feeble soul. Sounds great, right? This is one of the many ways in which Jesus takes the conventional beliefs of the day and turns them upside down. He's doing something countercultural. God incarnate came into the world to enter into the pain and suffering of those who needed him the most. And Jesus' example here is so important. As followers, we can allow his example and his love to transform us. We can become those who not only notice people's pain and suffering, but who have deep, stirring compassion for them. Like Jesus, we have to see the crowd, the millions across the UK who are struggling in poverty, as a group of precious and loved individuals, each created in God's image, each with their own unique story to tell. And that's certainly been my experience of the people that I've been meeting. In Matthew 14, we see that Jesus didn't feed the people all by himself. Even though he could have done it alone, we know. He asked his disciples to deliver the food for him. So let's have a little look. As evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a remote place and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so that they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food." And Jesus replied, "They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat." "We have here only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish," they answered. "Bring them here to me," he said, and he directed the people to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. So as a day of Jesus healing the sick draws to the close, the disciples decide it's time to send the people away. They look at the situation before them, the end of a long day, thousands of hungry people, the solitary place they're in, and they conclude, not unreasonably to be fair, that the best thing to do is to send the crowd away so that they can buy food for themselves. In that moment, they don't see themselves as part of the solution. Jesus, however, sees things differently. He sees that for those who follow him, to sit back and feed themselves is not an option. They have an opportunity to trust Jesus and to step out in compassionate action toward the crowd. Despite their apparent disinterest in the needs of the people around them, Jesus isn't angry at the disciples. Instead, he invites them to be a part of the solution, saying, "They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat." Jesus challenges his disciples, empowering them to step up to the plate, to exercise faith, and to meet the immediate practical needs of the people before them. The disciples don't have much to give materially. They manage to muster only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. But when they bring what little they have to the miracle-working Jesus, it becomes more than enough. Not only had his followers learned indirectly about Jesus' heart for people, a heart that notices and that feels deep compassion, they were now being shown something extraordinary. That when they accepted Jesus' invitation to step out in faith and put his compassion into action, the miraculous happened. And we can often feel, can't we, that what we have to offer is not enough. Perhaps I'm just speaking for myself, but I definitely feel that. But this story shows us that when we offer it up to Jesus in faithfulness, he can multiply it beyond what we can imagine. So that our tiny contribution of time or money or resources becomes something so much more significant. And Jesus' heart of compassion is central to the work of Christians Against Poverty. Yeah, I'm going to talk about that again. For 27 years, CAP has been committed to noticing the multitude of people crushed under the weight of debt and poverty. And we've allowed ourselves to be moved with deep compassion, compelled to do our small bit in faith to fight back and help bring the transformative hope of Jesus in people's most challenging times. It's our vision to see transformed lives, thriving churches, and an end to UK poverty. That's a vision that can only be realised by stepping out in faith and putting Jesus' compassion into action. To explain a little bit more about how this happens, I'd love to introduce you to Melinda. Her story is just one in a crowd of people today who has experienced the ruthlessness of poverty, but her story is also one of transformation and hope. And we've got a video ready to go. Wonderful. Let's watch Melinda's story now.
The cost of living in the UK is rising, and it's changing people's lives.
So many people skipping meals is a sobering
thing that a third of employers are likely to make redundancies over the next year.
The average household energy bill could surge above £4,200.
I'm 62 years young. I was born in Barbados. I have a mental health issue. And when my boys were very young, I got very ill and I was laid off work. I think if you've got a mental health label, people don't take you seriously. I was getting £64 a week to feed and clothe myself and my children. I had to choose between buying something as simple as a bra. I didn't buy because I would have to pay like the gas or the electric. The few things that I had started to break down. My fridge, my cooker, my television, and my washing machine all broke down within a week. And I went against my own principle of saving up. So I ran up over £2,000. I was also borrowing money from family members, seesawing between paying my bills and not having enough to live on. Sometimes I couldn't sleep at night because I was thinking, oh, I've got this to pay, I've got that to pay, and will the debt collectors be coming round? You know, the anxiety as to how will this play out was very real. I have had suicidal tendencies in the past, and my future never seemed set. I suddenly felt, because of my bills and because of my mental health situation, I was never going to make it, that I'm no good. I was very fortunate because the doctor I was seeing suggested Wimbledon Guild, and they recommended me to CAP. And when I contacted the number that they gave me, I spoke to Peter, and Peter was very, very helpful, very kind. And we went through the process that to get me out of debt, have all my bills and everything taken care of. And then one day he invited me to the church, and I went along. I was in awe because people were coming up to you and talking to you as though you were not a stranger, as though you were part of the family. And it's so uplifting. I really feel that I've come home, and I'm very glad to say that now I'm debt-free. And at first it didn't seem real because I had been struggling with my bills for a couple of years, more than a couple of years. To know that they had sorted it out in 3 months and that I didn't have to worry, it was such a relief. Oh, I can't tell you, I was so happy. Working with CAP has given me a desire to do better. I've actually started going to college, and I'm learning maths and IT. Peter encouraged me to become a befriender.
Having you there and saying, well, actually, I've recently gone through this process myself. It's a real comfort to other people to actually hear that, yes, you can get through the process and come to a place of flourishing.
Totally different point of view now. I'm looking forward to see what tomorrow will bring and what the future will hold. I'm feeling comfortable in myself and in my place with God. It has to be the work of God because there was no way out, but God has made a...
Oh, that cut off slightly sooner than I thought it was going to. God has made a way, just in case you were wondering. Sorry about that. Melinda's story is one of many, but I do always think it's really nice to actually see a client and see and hear from their point of view. But that story of hope and transformation and the local church facing poverty in their area and acting with the compassion of Jesus, I think is really powerful. And we see that transformation in the lives of many of our clients in all sorts of ways. And it's this that drives us to keep going. Because we want to see people across the UK released from poverty, living with faith in Jesus and hope for the future, just like you saw with Melinda. One way we do this is partnering with local churches, like this one, to run debt centres to provide face-to-face holistic debt help. And if you don't know a lot about what that looks like, I'd be very happy to talk to you about that later. Don't have time, unfortunately, to go into it today. CAP also partners with local churches to provide a range of friendly, supportive community groups called life skills groups and job clubs. And I know many of you will also be aware of the CAP money coaching courses that lots of churches offer, which help people in their communities to experience the freedom of feeling in control of their own finances. So there's lots of ways in which CAP offer these services, and each of these services, as well as the faithful partnership of local churches, is a crucial part of fulfilling that vision of transformed lives, thriving churches, and an end to UK poverty. And it's a big dream, but it's one that we really believe in. We're committed to acting with compassion, as Jesus does, to see a hope-filled society, free from poverty, with churches united to improve the lives of those facing debt and financial hardship. I'm going to return one final time to Matthew 14. The story finishes with the crowd fed and 12 baskets of broken pieces left over. Jesus doesn't just fix the problem here. He brings abundance in this solitary place. He does more than is needed, more than anyone could have imagined. The crowd is left amazed. In John's account, which I know is not the one we've been looking at, but John 6, 1 to 15, John tells us that in this moment, they realized that Jesus was the prophet that they had been expecting. And we believe that Jesus, that God is still working today to meet practical needs and to bring the hope of Jesus to those who need it. And we believe he is still using his people to do so. Right now in the UK, poverty appears to be winning, but we can play our part in fighting back. And we can fight in the same way that Jesus did, with the gut-wrenching compassion that causes us to act with abundant generosity. As we consider Jesus' compassion and how his disciples responded to his challenge to feed the crowd, may we be moved with the same compassion for the multitudes before us. May we accept Jesus' invitation to act as his disciples did that day, trusting that when we respond in faith, Jesus has the power to work miracles. Now, one way to respond with compassionate action today is by giving a donation to support the work of the Debt Centre here in Gloucester. Now, normally at this point, I'd be asking you to support the work of CAP nationally. But actually, today we're asking you to specifically help us with the local debt centre. Your donation would enable someone in our community to book an appointment to meet with a local debt coach like myself or like Dave, and take their first step on a journey towards a debt-free, hope-filled future. It will allow us to work towards a more sustainable future for our debt centre and help us to achieve our goal of helping more people than ever before in our city to find freedom from debt. We want to do this by employing a further debt coach, which will allow us to see more new clients each month. Now, I know that you are being invited to support a few things today with the food bank and the box of hope, all of which are really important to the community. But I do hope that you will prayerfully consider if supporting the debt centre locally might also be right for you. At the moment, we have just launched an exciting fundraising campaign, which means that, if you may have already noticed, that if you donate using the QR code or the link shown, thanks to matched funding from Aviva, your donation will be worth twice as much, up to a value of £250. We have 6 weeks to raise the money through this crowdfunding campaign, and it has just launched. So you are one of the first churches to be hearing about it. But I also don't want to ignore what you guys have already done for the Debt Centre in the last 3 years. I want to personally thank you for your support, and for choosing to put Jesus' outrageous and generous compassion into action. For the just short of 3 years that we have been running the Debt Centre in Gloucester so far, as a church, you have been so supportive with your finances, with your time, your resources, your prayers. And I have personally been so very grateful for that support on many occasions. You are doing the work of the kingdom here on earth, and I hope that you are encouraged today to continue to press into that. I'd encourage you to really seek opportunities to put Jesus' radical compassion into action in your neighbourhoods this week. What might it look like if we were moved to compassion for those around us as Jesus was? How might our schools, our workplaces, and the streets that we live on be changed by that? I'm going to let you guys think about that. But I'd like to close with a short prayer, if that's okay. Father, thank you for the example of your son, Jesus. Thank you for his deep compassion on the crowd of people he met on the shores of Galilee, and how you invite us to put the same compassion into action today. We pray that we, your church, would respond in faith to your calling to meet the practical needs of those suffering in debt and poverty around us. We ask that you would be transformed by Jesus' love and example. As we are, may we act in faith to see precious individuals in our communities freed from poverty and transformed too by the incredible, compassionate love of Jesus. Amen.